This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Big Screen podcast, where we talk about great movies and stories so great they should be movies. Find show notes, links to subscribe, and leave Apple Podcast reviews by going to our website, beyondthebigscreen.com. And now, let's go beyond the big screen.
Welcome back, friends of ours. Today, Mustache Chris and I are going to start a short series on one particular player whose force of personality dominated in an era full of dominating personalities in the American Mafia. In the 1960s and early 1970s was a sort of a golden age for the Mafia and Italian American organized crime. And one of the most important and influential members was a man named Crazy Joe Gallo. Crazy Joe was not only up to his neck in organized crime, he became a celebrity in both his own times and after. He had 2 movies made about fictionalized versions of his life, and he featured prominently in the 2019 Martin Scorsese film, The Irishman. Crazy Joe has been played by incredible actors, including Jerry Orbach, who became a personal friend of Joe's, Peter Boyd, and Sebastian Maniscalco. In this episode, Mustache Chris and I will explore Joey Gallo's history and background. In this episode and a few upcoming episodes in this series, Mustache Chris and I will explore Joey Gallo's history and background. Then we will look at the fictionalized versions of his life and times in a few movies, particularly the 2 that were made more or less during his lifetime or right around his lifetime, The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight and Crazy Joe. We more or less stumbled into this deep dive into Joe Gallo thanks to a listener, Amma. So I'd like to give Amma a shout out because she's the one who suggested The Gang That Couldn't Shoot Straight, because I don't know about you, Mustache Chris, but I probably would have never watched that movie in a million years if somebody had suggested it.
No, and I mean, when that podcast comes out, you'll hear our opinions on that movie.
So, Mustache Chris, before we dive in too much and into the detail, what do you think about this journey we're about to take on the story of Crazy Joe? How do you think your understanding of the history of the American Mafia has changed since looking into Crazy Joe?
I'd say Crazy Joe Gallo is one of those pivotal moments in American Mafia history. Like, once we get into his story, what Crazy Joe did, there was no turning back. He's one of those figures that just kind of show up in history, and there's moments where certain individuals, they show up and they do things, and then it becomes very clear, maybe not to the people at the time, but it becomes very clear shortly after that because of the actions of this one person, there was no going back to the way things were before. I mean, there's numerous examples of that in history, and I have a little bit on that. Probably we're going to save that for the end of the episode, but where Lucky Luciano and say the end of the Castellamare War was led to a certain area of the Mafia. After Joe Gallo, there was no basically led to a different era of the Mafia, not necessarily for the good, in my opinion.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And then I would also say that Crazy Joe we talk about the movies that were made about him. This is the time of The Godfather, when fiction, or when reality started to model fiction. And in a lot of ways, Crazy Joe was a model for the fiction. It was this weird loop of the mafiosi trying to act more and more like The Godfather, but they were, in a lot of ways, The Godfather was being influenced by people like Crazy Joe, like this whole thing that was going on in the popular culture. And then we'll see some things where Joe just explodes into the popular imagination. And then I also think that, like you said, this pivotal moment in not only just Mafia history, but American history of the late 1960s, and I guess in world history, but really, I mean, we're focusing a lot on American history, especially in these couple of series, that so much was changing in the culture for the better and for the worse. And Crazy Joe somehow seemed to be in the middle of all of it.
Yeah, it is really wild. Like, and it's weird. Like when you think about it, like Crazy Joe's actions marked like a point where history had changed in the American Mafia, and it was never going to go back to the way it was, like I pointed out earlier. But at the same time, the civil rights movement and the success of the civil rights movement led to a different era of American history. And I mean, we can argue, well, I think we're planning on doing an episode of the Italian Civil Rights League. And regardless, there's no going back before the civil rights movement. It's just not going to happen. And Crazy Joe is part of both of them, you know, one in criminality and another one in just general politics across the entire land.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Joe is in every way imaginable a man of the streets, and he gets right into criminal activity basically from birth. He was born to it. What is the story of Crazy Joe's early upbringing?
Yeah, Joe Gallo was born in Red Hook, Brooklyn, New York. His parents were Umberto and Mary, and Umberto was like a small-time bootlegger himself, and then he would turn the money that he got from the bootlegging into like a small loan shark operation. He ran like small businesses, but at the time, the Great Depression hit, and I mean, bootlegging was a good way to make money, right? Especially on the side. And from my reading, Umberto was never like a made guy in the mob, but he was like for sure in those types of circles. Like people knew who he was. And Umberto would encourage Joey and his brothers to get into the lifestyle because, you know, that's what great dads do. You know, like your dad's a criminal. Why don't you just become a criminal too? Yeah. And the myth of Joe Gallo would kind of, this a big part of Joe Gallo is almost I don't know how, I think later on in his life, he was like understanding that he was creating a myth about himself, and he would do certain things to help this myth grow. But a lot of it is people throwing it on too, right? Just the whole myth making of Joe Gallo is a huge part of his story. Yeah. So the myth of Joe Gallo would have most people believe that he was pretty much spent his entire life in southern Brooklyn, but the reality is he spent a big chunk of his early life in Kensington, New York City.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're starting to see in broad strokes that there's the Manhattan things going on, Brooklyn going on, but it gets very granular from that point too, that inside of Manhattan, there's different power structures, and inside of Brooklyn, there's different neighborhoods with all sorts of stuff going on, and that it means something.
Oh yeah, for sure. You know, because New York City is one of, if not the oldest major city in the United States, right? It really is. We were on podcast doesn't come out, but we were talking about this is a little tangent, but we were talking about LA on the previous podcast we were recording and came out, and I made a comment about how LA was the youngest big city in the United States, and it shows in terms of how the policing works and just everything about it. Like from my understanding, like LA doesn't have like these little like small, I guess they're not really ethnic communities anymore. They still have it, but not anything like New York. Like you listen to New Yorkers talk, and it almost seems like their accent changes depending on which part of New York they're from. It's crazy. But to I guess get back to the main story. Yeah, his family ran like a Greasy Spoon restaurant. So basically, like Joe Gallo and his brothers had like the holy trinity of the mob lifestyle: bootlegging, loan sharking, and owning a restaurant. Joe would attend school until he was 16, where he would drop out of an automotive vocational school. And not long after that, he would get into an automobile accident himself. And from my understanding, this is where he had a famous tic which added to the Crazy Joe part. And he had a series of mental health problems that would follow him for the rest of his life. At this point, he would end up like being diagnosed with schizophrenia. So the term Crazy Joe is not like, oh, like he was a crazy. He literally was crazy. And people push back on that and say it's insensitive. But if you're suffering from schizophrenia, you're by definition, you're crazy, right? You need to be on medications. You're not seeing the world straight. Yeah. So it was about at this time that Joe would start to get involved in more serious criminality with a gentleman named Pete the Greek Diapolis and Frank Elanalo. And and they would run like most of their crimes, out of like various pool halls and, the infamous, I guess you guys are probably used to the candy shop being a base of operations for criminality, which especially this early model, will never stop making me laugh. They're selling chocolate bars and pieces of candy and then drugs out the back, out of the back of the store or something. And, but it was around this time too that another very pivotal moment happened in Joe's life early on. Was he saw a movie called The Kiss of Death, and it came out in 1949. Basically modeled his entire persona after the character Tommy Udo that's in this movie, and I've watched a bit of it, and I totally see it. Joe would be famous for like reciting lines in this movie, and basically for the rest of his life, to one degree or another, pretending that he was this Tommy Udo.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, he gets right to it with criminality. His father's something a little bit more than a small time crook. I mean, he seems to make a career out of it. But then, but now that we have some of the background of Joe Gallo, let's look at his full introduction, really, where he comes into his fullness into the criminal world of mid-century New York City, and a place where there's a mob. And it's a very criminal time in history. Where does Joe fit into this?
Yeah, Joey, along with his brothers Albert and Larry, worked for I'm going to have to get used to this during this series. There's going to be a lot of Joes. Worked for Joe Profaci. We had mentioned him on the previous. You guys want a quick rundown of like just a very like bare minimum? We did a series, 5 episodes and 5 families. The first 5 episodes that came out. So we touched on Joe Profaci a little bit in that episode, and we're this one we're going to touch on him in a little bit too, but eventually I think we're going to end up doing just a series on Joe Profaci because he was so important in the history of the American Mafia. Yeah, so his brother, Joey, his brother, Albert and Larry worked for Joe Profaci, and the Profaci family mainly is like enforcers and hitmen. The brothers would help manage their dad's loan sharking operation. They would run their own rackets of like vending machines, and one of the more lucrative endeavors that they cornered the market on was jukebox machines, which I always found that really bizarre. But I guess, not everyone had radios, I get, and so the only way to really get like music playing in a place was jukeboxes. So they would go to these places and basically tell them like, you put our jukebox in there or we're going to smash your windows or break your fingers.
And you figure, but in a time, obviously before iPods, and well, I even dated myself calling them iPods, but without on-demand music that with the jukebox, it was pretty cool that you could pick what song you wanted to listen to, and it's all cash, like all these things, vending machines, and these things like jukeboxes where you're just swimming in cash.
Well, it just makes it harder to like trace of whose machines these are, like where did the cash go? We'll get into it a little bit later on in the mob. They start getting involved in like government contracts, and it's more money, it's more power to get involved in like big projects like that. And we'll find out as we go through the history of the mafia. But I don't know, it opens you up to all different types of things, like that's when you start getting into like major racketeering, and the government's just like, yeah, we can't have the mafia controlling just all the concrete that's being poured in New York City. It's like, we just can't allow that. But if they just say maybe stuck to jukeboxes as an example, yeah, the government might come in and bust them up once in a while, but they're not, I don't know, it's not going to be a high priority for them. Yeah, and then Joey was involved in gambling, like the typical numbers, which is, if people aren't familiar, the numbers was basically the lottery, dice games, various card games. The Gallo crew ran most of its operations. I guess it's now famous. The dormitory, where it was like this building in New York, where I don't know, I guess you can call it kind of like a castle. I don't, is the best way I would describe it, where you're like, that's basically where the whole crew lived, and they ran the entire operation out of there. And it's famously depicted in the movie Crazy Joe, which we did a podcast on, and eventually that one will come out too. Yeah, and apparently at this like dormitory, the rumor is that apparently Joe Gallo kept a pet lion down in the basement. You know what? I'm just going to say I believe that, just because it seems like something Crazy Joe would do, because why not? You know, Mike Tyson had a tiger. He was kind of crazy. Crazy Joe reminds me of Mike Tyson in some ways. So why wouldn't he have a lion? You know, yeah. And the pet lion is just part of, like, I don't know, I would say is part of the whole myth making of Joe Gallo. It's like, we're like, you know what? We just kind of, oh, why not? Just go with it. It's true. It seems like it's a fun part of the story. So why not just believe it's true? Yeah, Gallo himself too, where this is part of the the aspect of Joe Gallo that people, I don't know, they tend to forget if they think this guy's kind of a cool guy. He ran a few nightclubs, which is whatever, that's not a big deal, but he ran sweatshops in New York, right? Believe it or not, at this time, you know, I mean, they still exist to this day, but this time in New York, there were still sweatshops. With horrible working conditions, you know, making cheap fabrics, and even still right up until, you know, the late 50s.
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
So in 1957, actually, Carlo Gambino came to Joe Profaci and asked him to make a crew to take out none other than the Lord High Executioner, Albert Anastasia. And on October 25th, Albert, going for his routine shave and haircut, entered a Central Park hotel barber shop. Two men covering their faces entered the shop almost immediately, and after Albert sat down to relax, shot him to death. And there's actually, you know, if you're just squeamish, but I wouldn't look at them, but there's quite a few photos of this famous hit that went down at this barber shop. You know, it's up for debate who actually killed Albert Anastasia. You know, at this point in his criminal career, Albert Anastasia, you know, had lots of enemies. He wasn't playing by the rules. He was pissing people off, like Carlo Gambino, Meyer Lansky, and many others. Albert was also a degenerate gambler that owned a lot of money to people for outstanding horse bets. I believe he was actually losing his house at this point. This is how bad his gambling got out of hand. The story goes that Carmine Persico and Joey Gallo were the ones that Joey Gallo was the one that killed Albert Anastasia. But I mean, I don't know for sure. It's possible. I've heard different stories. I mean, people say, "Oh, why would they lie about that?" But I mean, if you're going to take out a guy who ran Murder Inc. and his nickname was the Lord High Executioner, probably a good thing to brag on the streets about if you're, you know, surrounded by a bunch of other psychopaths and you know, tough guys who are macho tough guys. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it seems like one of those things that there's no reason not to believe that he did it, but you know, we're probably never going to know 100% if he's the one who actually committed the crime. It kind of makes sense to me in the fact that at this point, he's not a made man or anything. But he's very closely connected with all of this. So he would be a good kind of person to put onto this sort of job. Wouldn't be able to say one way or the other. Like, yes, I put my, I'm going to put all my chips behind that Joe Gallo did whack Albert Anastasia, but I don't see any reason to say why he couldn't have done it.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel. I mean, he would have been capable of doing it. Him and Persico for sure were 100% capable of actually doing that. But I mean, there's also reasons why they would just make it up, right? Why would you not? If you took out Albert and maybe if you repeat it enough times, people end up believing in it, and it's like, these are the guys that took out Albert. Don't screw around with them. Make sure you pay your big payment on time, type thing, right? Like, there's a lot of incentive to just take credit for something like that in those circles, But
and incentive for somebody like Carlo Gambino to just let that go. Why fight that rumor? Even if Carlo Gambino did it himself, for all we know, or any other combination of people who did it. It works in anybody's advantage that if it's a myth or if it's reality, just let it take a life of its own and run with it.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I would agree with that. Just go with it, and then maybe less people starts asking about, I don't think Carlo Gambino was very happy about what Albert was doing. And I thought this whole thing is, the bosses weren't supposed to, kill the other bosses. You know what I mean? That just, it's convenient for him too, right?
And there's, I think with giving the credit to Joe Gallo, it doesn't reek of BS like so many of the other ones that we've talked about, where it's pretty clear somebody is taking responsibility for the notoriety and the fame that comes from a big hit. I don't get the sense of any like screaming, flashing lights that this is BS.
Yeah.
Now, if Joe's story up to this point hasn't been crazy enough, it gets positively nuts when Joe speaks before the United States Congress. What on earth is Joe doing?
Yeah, the following year, Joe Gallo would be summoned to speak at the McClellan Committee, which was a special committee that was set up to investigate organized crime, in particular organized crime and labor unions. Robert F. Kennedy would be like he wasn't the only guy, but he would be probably the most famous person that was one of the heads of this committee, and who during the course of the podcast will probably end up talking a fair amount about, because Robert F. Kennedy's like one of these types of figures where he fits in there with like Thomas Dewey and like Rudy Giuliani, as he's kind of like crusader types against the mob. And Robert in a lot of ways was very successful at exposing the mob and its ties to labor unions. Did a very good job at that. Where Thomas Dewey was more, look at what these guys are doing, like prostitution and like killing each other, drug running. And Rudy Giuliani was really, I don't want to say it was just him, but it's, we'll get into all of that. But, you can't take it away from Rudy Giuliani. He's really the one that drove the nail in the coffin for the American Mafia. They're still around, obviously, but they're never going to be like what they used to be. And Rudy deserves a lot of credit for that. Joey, Joey or Joe, I don't know. I always call him Joey Gallo. Joe would make an iconic public appearance before the mob, dressed in an all black suit, like rocking out a pretty impressive set of sunglasses. And you guys can look up pictures of this when he's at the Senate meeting. It doesn't even look like real life. Looks like something like out of I don't know, like a comic book movie. Would you not? Would you agree with that description?
Oh yeah, I mean it's insane. I don't know any other way to do it. we probably won't talk about The Irishman as such, because Joe Gallo, he is a part of it, but he's not a huge part of it. But they dramatize some of the hearings with Sebastian Maniscalco, and it's just freaking awesome.
Yeah, he's like smoking a dart in between questions, and it's like it's so funny. And like Joe Gallo apparently was like flirting with RFK's like secretaries during the hearing, and like, you know, when they would ask him questions, he was like just continuously pleading the fifth, right? That's all. He didn't talk, right? And that's one thing I'll give Joe is he was a gangster to the core, right? He wasn't going to say anything about anything. Like, yeah, I would say like this whole Senate committee, like I just pointed out, it just perfectly shows just how much Joey was a gangster. That's who he was, right? He wasn't going to be anything else. It's perfect. He also would crack jokes. It's something about, I think it was the rug in RFK's like office or whatever. He's like, oh, this would be a great, you know, this is great rug to play like a dice game or something or what have you. Like just didn't care at all. You know, it's like, oh, you guys are going to do your thing. I'm going to do my thing. You know, just leave me alone.
And you almost don't know if he's doing it on purpose, putting on such a show, or if that was just 100% natural to him.
It's hard to tell because of the mental health issues that he had. Like, how much was Joey just being himself, or was he consciously putting on an act? Like and writing the notes, I've thought about this quite often where I'm thinking, well, as a person who's mentally sound, I'd be like, yeah, like he's consciously putting on an act. But I'm mentally sound, you know, Crazy Joe is not mentally sound. So it's sometimes it's hard to tell. It's like, I think at some points he knows exactly what he's doing. At other points, he's just being himself.
One thing I would like to add to this is maybe we're going down a road of a little bit of conspiracy theories, but there's so many conspiracy theories on Robert F. Kennedy's brother, John F. Kennedy, of being murdered by the Mafia. And honestly, the Mafia had more reason to kill RFK. And I hear very little. There are some theories out there, but it's pretty thin case to say that Sirhan, just some random guy. I think he was a Palestinian, and supposedly he was mad about something with the Israelis, and so he kills RFK. It never really made sense to me in the past, but holy smokes, does the Mafia have all the reason in the world to want to kill RFK?
Steve here with a quick word from our sponsors.
Yeah, very possible. I've thought about it, you know, many times where, like you pointed out, like the official story just doesn't make a whole ton of sense to me. In terms of the Mafia and his brother, if you guys are interested, we could do a whole thing on that because that's a huge subject. And there's a lot of, maybe it'll be like Oliver Stone, or I'm trying to think who Kevin Costner, Kevin Costner in the JFK movie. We're just like, that's going to, if we do that series, that's probably going to be us. I'll have fun doing it. But, I'm fairly convinced the mob had something to do with it. So I'll just but once I start really doing the deep dives, maybe I'll have a different opinion. But John just did so many things that was affecting the mob, and then his brother too. I don't know. I just find it hard to believe that like Robert, his death didn't have anything to do with the mob, or the mob didn't know anything about it. I don't know. I just find that hard to believe, considering like they had discussed about killing Thomas Dewey. They didn't end up doing it, and even Rudy Giuliani, they thought about doing him in, right? And they decided against it. So it's not like the mob was like above taking care of certain individuals that were causing a lot of trouble. They just would kind of weigh the pros and cons. And, we talked about on the Murder Inc., where I think they wrongly decided to not kill Thomas Dewey from their perspective. You argued the other side, but it makes a lot of sense for why they would want to take out Robert, because Robert was really a one-man crusade against the Mafia. And, a lot of people theorized that John went after the Mafia because his dad had connections to the Mafia, and he felt ashamed that that was the case, that a lot of the family's wealth came from, you know, dirty mafia money.
Now, Joe winds up getting himself involved directly in a series of conflicts with the Colombo family. We'll get into a little bit of that in this episode. And then when we continue into the next episode, we'll get into more detail. But let's take a little bit of a look at what events precipitate this series of civil wars inside of the Colombo family.
Yeah, there was a fair amount leading up to the first Colombo War. We touched a bit on it in the 5 Families in 5 episode series. I think we should save the like all the Colombo Wars. I think we'll end up doing like a deep dive because there's many of them. You know, there was like the 2 that we're going to talk about here, but there was a third one, and it's up for debate about other ones. If you listen to the Colombo episode, you'll find that there's a theme in the Colombo family, and it's chaos and a lot of wars. And so we'll just like kind of like lightly skim over these wars. At the core of the Colombo War was basically Joe Profaci's greed and Joey Gallo and his crew feeling like they were getting ripped off. That was at the core of it. Joe Profaci was like infamous for being cheap with his fellow family members, and probably the most egregious example of this was like an extra mafia tax. Back in Sicily, the mafia would do like a collection of money from each member of the family, and it was all pooled together to cover like various things like legal problems, taking care of family members if somebody went to jail. It was kind of like like an insurance policy, really. You know, you pay into insurance, certain things get covered. If stuff happens, you get sick, or you know, your house burns down, or you know, your car gets into an accident. And the thing with that though is like over in America, this practice they didn't really do it, and it was only the Profaci family that was actually doing it. So like very quickly, people in the Profaci family, the Colombo family, could just look across the street and go like, oh, you guys in the Bonanno family aren't paying this tax. You guys in the Gambino family aren't paying this tax. Or the Genovese family, you're not paying this tax. It's just, I don't know, it just was not very smart by Joe Profaci to be doing this. To making the matters even worse, like the money that was being collected wasn't even being used for the stuff it was claimed to be used for. So Joe Profaci was just basically taxing every member of his crew just to be part of the family. Just ridiculous. It's just so greedy. You want to bring down any, like a nation, a relationship, anything, like greed is one of those things that almost guarantees that you will do it. And I would, from my research, the one event I think that really kicked Joe into revolting against his boss was this situation with Frank Abduzmarco. Frank was a prolific racketeer, gambler, loan shark. He had risen into the rank of capo, and capo was basically a guy who ran his own crew under the boss, right? Who was Joe Profaci. Frank, seeing the BS that Joe Profaci was pulling with the mafia tax, stopped paying it, and Joe Profaci saw this as a challenge to his authority as a dangerous precedent for all the other members. Called for a hit of Frank, and on November 4th, 1959, Frank would be gunned down outside of a bar. Joey Gallo and his brothers have been long suspected as the ones who killed Frank, and as apparently they were promised a good chunk of Frank's criminal empire in return. But what ended up happening was apparently Joe Profaci just gave it to his closer friends and family. And for the Gallo crew, this was the final straw, and they decided to, and it ended up becoming a famous saying, hit the mattresses.
I'm going to tear a page out of Mustache Chris's book and come up with an obscure historical comparison to Joe Profaci. And to me, it really reminds me of King John of England. uh, he's the one who basically the Magna Carta gets kicked off because of him. And he was just essentially a scumbag who soaked his barons, and his barons are really a very close analogy to the made men, where the made men are kicking up money upstairs all the time. That's a part of the deal, is you kick money upstairs. But then to add these stupid things like the taxes, and to use basically to game the system that the people respect, to just squeeze some more money out of them, it's never going to go well. And it really doesn't catch up with Joe Profaci. If you go back and listen to our 5 families on the Colombos, and we've done some other episodes briefly on Joe Profaci, he just dies. But to me, he's seen it. I see him, and I think that maybe you'll disagree with me, or maybe you'll agree with me, but I think the other made guys, basically, his barons saw him as a greedy fat cat. He had these businesses where he was making tons of money. He's making tons of money from the criminal rackets, and he's making money of people kicking their money upstairs to him. So he's wetting his beak, as they say, on all these different things, but he's giving like nothing back to the people who got him there.
That's exactly it, right? Like Joey and the other members of the Colombo family, but in particular Joey Gallo's crew, they saw like, we're the ones taking all the risks. Like, we're the ones risking getting shot. We're the ones risking getting stabbed. We're the ones risking going to jail on a daily basis. And we're kicking money up, and we're kicking way more money up than everybody else in comparison to the families, say, just right across the street from us. And when you feel like you're getting robbed like that, it just creates a recipe for like chaotic outbreak. I mean, really, at the end of the day, what was the American Revolution about, right? Was taxation without representation, right? And, we can go back and forth whether those taxes were fair or not. I think England was somewhat justified in some of the taxes, considering the previous war that had happened, right? But they didn't have any representation, so they couldn't argue whether these taxes were just or not, right? In a lot of ways, the Gallo crew couldn't go to Joe Profaci and say, this extra tax you're making us pay that you're just putting in your pocket, like, what's the deal here, guy? Like, can you explain why this is going on? They couldn't do that. So the only way that they could really show their disagreement was to quite literally revolt.
And it's even more than, I think any one of them would be happy if everybody's earning, everybody's making money, and they have to kick up a little bit more to Joe Profaci. It's the absolute disrespect of them that Joe Profaci is a high roller, but it treats himself like he really thought he was Don Corleone or like a king or something, and he disrespected people. And you're talking about men of honor, that these people really put a lot of weight into this idea of respect, and you just can't go along disrespecting people like that. But talking about that, so what were some of the key events of this first Colombo War, and how does it conclude?
Yeah, so on February 27, 1961, the Gallo crew kidnapped 4 of Joe Profaci's top men, one was his brother, and one was Magliocco, who will end up becoming later down the road the head of the Profaci family. Joe, being a coward or a smart guy, I guess, depends on your perspective, ran to Florida. I guess he got word that this was going to happen, and Larry and Albert, after the kidnapping, basically demanded to Joe Profaci, like, we wanted a more favorable financial agreement for the release of the hostages, where Joey Gallo, on the other hand, said, you know what, like, let's just kill one of the hostages and then demand $100,000, and then before we even start talking. And now people would probably be like dismissive of this, saying that's why Crazy Joe has the nickname Crazy. But like, let me lay out like defensive Joe's approach. Like, if you're going to kidnap your mob bosses, top guys, you've pretty much declared war on them. And if you're going to you pretty much have declared war on them. And if you're going to kidnap your mob bosses, like top guys, you've declared war on them, right? Larry and Albert were just kind of looking at this like they were kind of half in by saying like, oh, like we're just like kind of negotiating like better financial arrangements. Where you take Joe's approach, he basically accepts the fact that like, what we've done, that means we're at war, right? And we have to show that we're dead serious, that we're willing to go to war. So yeah, we'll just kill one of the hostages. We'll demand money, and then we'll start the negotiations. Whereas, like I said, like Albert and Larry's approach looks timid, but eventually they decide that they're going to. Joey gets overruled, and Albert and Larry's approach is the one that they end up going with. I don't know. What's your opinion? Because I don't think he's crazy thinking that was the right course of action. Like you're already at war at that point. So
I don't know. That's such a tough call. And I think you have to look at that again. Joe Gallo and his crew are doing this war, and they're not even made men in the Mafia. They're still outside of the system, and you have to look at it in a way that anything could be on the table because they don't have to follow these rules. There's no reason they can't go completely over the top on this and get what they want. Would they maybe turn the ire of the other families against them? But again, almost who cares? They have their fiefdom and their part, their corner of their neighborhood. Why not go for it all?
Yeah, that to me, like you brought up, that's the one argument against Joey's Crazy Joe's approach is what are the other families going to think about? Like if you kill like a top mob guy, made mob guy, right, and then demand $100,000, maybe in the sense of like, oh, like you're going too far. So like this families are either going to actively get involved in the conflict or they're going to turn on you, right? So that's the only argument I could think of. And maybe that's what Albert and Larry are thinking. And they're smarter than both me and Joe. I don't know. But like, I look at it, people would be just so dismissive, being like, oh, he's just crazy. And I'm like, well, I mean, Albert and Larry kidnapped the guys. And then they're being like, oh, like, we'll just like negotiate like slightly better like financial arrangements and everything will just go right back to the way they were. I think that was just wishful thinking. Joe Profaci couldn't just allow that to happen. There's no chance.
I think on the other hand, we're on like the fifth hand now of the other hand. You could see that making a play like that, if you've gone that far, and Larry went along with it. You go that far. If you don't take it to its logical conclusion, you're leaving yourself with a huge target on your back at the end of the day. At the end of the conflict, the conflict's going to end.
Well, and we'll find out just in a little bit that maybe they should have listened to Joe.
But then on one more other hand, you could see that using that as a chip that, hey, look at what we were able to do. Where we were basically able to take down an entire family. Maybe the other families might say, well, let's, the Joe Profaci and his ruling group are a total bunch of screw ups. Let's wipe them out of the way and put in somebody who seems capable and hungry. I think you could see it. I think when you do something really bold like that, anything could happen.
Yeah, for sure. Let's just say in theory, we're just spitballing here. Let's say in theory, they actually were able to kidnap Joe Profaci. I'm sure Crazy Joe would be, let's just kill him. And then once he's killed, maybe the families they'll just put us in charge and we'll just rename it the Gallo family. Oh, that would have been. Oh man, I just thinking about like just the Gallo family and thinking, oh my God, we could have got so many good podcasts out of that.
But I think that sees that again, that would have led to a very different mafia for the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s than what we actually saw. Like, if you really did have a person who blew up the system like that, then you would see probably something much more like the Mexican cartels, where they're very cutthroat on taking out other cartels. And maybe that's what the mafia would have degenerated into.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, no, that's probably pretty accurate what would happen. I mean, they became a little bit more loosey-goosey. It depends on what time in history you're talking about. For the most part, the idea of taking out bosses was anathema. But I mean, we've already talked about it a couple of times where, people have taken out the bosses. And probably the one that people are most famous for in terms of somebody taking out a boss is John Gotti taking out Paul Castellano at Sparks Steakhouse. I would assume that's probably the one most people know about. So, bosses getting taken out, it wasn't frequent, but it did happen.
Yeah, and I think that if we're going there, I think you see that one was really with John Gotti taking out Paul Castellano was more of what Joe Gallo was going for, that he didn't have the sanction of the commission or anything like that, where Carlo Gambino had at least a wink and a nod from the other bosses, where Joe Gallo just completely went off the rails and did his own thing on this when he wasn't even made. Like, you don't even really have a seat at the table at this point. Like, it's like me going, I mean, more than me, because he was a connected guy. And it was just the fact that there was I guess you might say a blip in the system, that for a long time they weren't initiating new members into the mafia, that for all intents and purposes, Joe was a member. He just didn't have the official stamp of approval, you might say. But it's just wild. It really is outside of the realm of what really was going on at that time. Let's wrap up this very first war of the Colombo family. You could call it a civil war.
Steve here again with a quick word from our sponsors.
Oh yeah, for sure, it's a civil war. That's one. Yeah, 100%. I would say it's a civil war. Yeah. So after a couple of weeks, there was like an agreement that was reached, and the hostages were returned, and Joe Profaci agreed to better financial arrangements for the Gallo crew. This obviously was not going to work. Like, Joe Profaci was just saying this. He wasn't actually going to stay true to his word, because I don't know. There's probably a theme here. I'm not a big fan of Joe Profaci. He's a coward. Yeah. And Joe Profaci starts calling for the hits of Gallo crew members. One of the first guys to get taken out was he was part of the Gallo crew, Joe Jelly. He was on a fishing trip, and I guess the guy that he was on a fishing trip with, shot him in the head. Probably the more famous one was Larry Gallo was ambushed at the Sahara Club, or like Carmine Persico, who was a member of the Gallo crew, and a fellow gangster would attempt to strangle him to death, and they got pretty close. And the thing that ended up saving Larry, ironically, was a police officer intervening basically at the moment of his death. And this is where Carmine Persico gets the nickname the Snake, was his betrayal of the Gallo crew. And I bet we're going to do like a whole thing on Carmine Persico, because he led like a really crazy life. In the movie, it's that we'll end up talking about, the Crazy Joe. They depict this somewhat accurately, but they change the characters around a little bit. Yeah, and the war would continue for quite some time, and I think 9 people died. A couple people went missing. People went missing, just assume that they're dead too. Yeah, and the Gallo crew basically ran this war from the dormitory that they basically built it into a fortress with like trap doors, and they used like chicken wire and mattresses. So when grenades and stuff like that might have got thrown into the building, the chicken wire would stop it from going into the building, and then they would bounce off the mattresses and go back at the people that threw the grenades and stuff. Like, crazy to think this type of stuff was going on in New York, like not that long ago. It's basically a failed state in a lot of ways. Yeah, and they kept like a vast arsenal in the building, and one of the crazier stories that Joe would have gone to jail, but this at this time, but apparently there was like a fire that was near this dormitory, and Larry and Albert would save, like, I believe it was 6 kids from this fire, and it was like all over the news. And they were getting good news coverage, obviously, because they saved a bunch of kids from a fire. And it's in the movie, it makes it seem like, for at least from what I read, that Joe Gallo was like one of the guys that were saving the kids, but I could be mistaken about this, but I think he was in jail at the time that this happened.
Yeah, it shows that they're just not completely scum. They were, the guys, they weren't complete scum. It was basically that this was their job. They weren't going out and spraying and praying and killing all sorts of people, and collateral damage. And they were, Joe was in criminal elements and Joe and his crew, they did criminal stuff. They did some shakedowns and that, but I think that they were honestly, in a way, good people. They cared about their neighbors. It's kind of weird to look at that dichotomy.
For sure. And then, like, in some ways you can't like kind of hold it against these guys, and because this is what they grew up in, like the mob ran the neighborhood in a lot of ways, and for generations and generations. How can you really fault guys that grew up in this atmosphere? And they were just kind of continuing this tradition where paid a mafia tax, and the mob would look out for your store, and they actually did. Where nowadays, like the liquor store getting robbed and like the corner store and stuff like that, a lot of this type of stuff just did not happen in mafia controlled neighborhoods. It just didn't. And then once the mafia was kind of taken out of place, you saw the rise of this stuff. I mean, John Gotti talked about this. You guys are going to miss the day when you don't have John Gotti to kick around anymore. I mean, that's John Gotti's egotism and narcissism coming out, but it was accurate in a lot of ways, where crime was somewhat organized in New York, where soon when the mafia was kicked out, it became disorganized crime in a lot of ways, and cops that are honest will admit this. I'm sure I would love to hear Frank's opinion on this.
I would love to see. There's probably a better wording. I would really be very interested to see that in this day and age where policing is breaking down, especially in the cities where crime is rising, if you're going to see a rise in crime and criminal elements offering protection. I haven't seen much of that, but it would seem like it's a natural thing that if the police aren't going to protect you, somebody else is probably going to step in and fill that void. I mean, that's what happened with the mafia in the early 1900s. Is in a lot of ways they stepped up and filled in a void that people weren't protecting neighborhood businesses, and providing protection is something that people really strongly desire. Now, speaking of, that's kind of talking about the law enforcement side of it. And Joe Gallo is going to see both sides. Now, Joe's life is basically divided into 3 phases, as I see it. This early phase up into this first Civil War, Colombo Civil War, then a really big chunk of his life where he's in jail, and then really the end of the Celebrity Joe. We're going to move into a little bit right now into the jail phase. What happened? How did Joe wind up in jail? And maybe we'll zoom out a little bit and talk about why this phase was so important in his development. And then we'll, in the next episode, get into some of the details of his time in jail, because that's a whole probably could be a series, to be quite honest, in and of itself. But for our purposes, we'll discuss it in the next episode.
Yeah, Joey Gallo would be caught like extorting the local mafia tax off of a businessman and would be sentenced to 7 to 14 years in prison. To me, I always find it funny. It's something small that usually gets these guys, like they're collecting the mafia tax, right? I mean, it's a huge part of the mafia because, like, you have like a couple guys that aren't paying the tax, then all of a sudden nobody else is going to be paying the tax, and that leads to all types of problems in terms of revenue and prestige and respect in the neighborhood. Yeah, and during this like course of his prison stint, he would end up serving like time in three different jails. I guess they kept on shipping him from one to the next. But his time in jail, Joe Profaci would die of natural causes in 1962, and Magliocco would end up becoming head of the family, and Carmine Persico would actually spend a little bit of time in jail himself for the attempted murder of Larry Gallo, which, Larry Gallo wouldn't say, I guess because the cops saw him doing it, but when they were asking Larry Gallo, who was trying to kill you, just go, I don't know. Even it's great, like just gangsters to the core. And I think, like you pointed out, we'll leave some of the details because it's a huge topic. Joe's time in jail. It's very foundational to the entire myth of Joe Gallo. He'll start working with black gangs. He'll start reading a lot. This is where the celebrity of Joe Gallo starts. It starts in prison, and when he gets out of prison.
So let's end that for today with Joe getting settled into jail. But before we go, let's talk about the importance of Crazy Joe as we're pausing about midway through his life. And especially, we'll pause and take a look at him up to this point. How would you evaluate the decisions and the actions of Crazy Joe Gallo up to his entering jail?
Effective, right? I mean, he ran a successful crew, and he kidnapped, basically took on the entire Profaci family. And if they had listened to him, maybe things would have turned out differently in that first Colombo War. Highly entertaining, makes for great storytelling. In a lot of ways, like he led like a revolution inside the mafia. This might seem kind of obscure, but in a lot of ways, you can kind of see the revolution that Joe Gallo led in the. I'm not saying Joe Gallo was a revolutionary. He was he like consciously was doing this. I just think he just kind of did it by accident. Where you could draw comparisons to, say, the Roman Empire, which ran a lot like, especially the Republic, ran a lot like a mafia state. You could kind of see the end of the Castellamare War is like the foundation of the Roman Republic, and the Commission is a fill-in for the Roman Republic, and the Commission ran much like kind of like the Senate did. You had ranks, right? And the Senate was at the top, and it was usually elderly statesmen that were making decisions for the Republic, with slight input from other people. And it ran really effectively because there was a lot of unwritten rules that people just followed. Like, you don't take out the bosses, you stay within your rank, you do your job, you'll move up the ranks. Now, we're not saying you're to become a senator, but if you keep your nose clean, do what you're supposed to do, you're going to move up. Whereas, like, you start getting into the late Republic, much like, say, the late Republic, where the elites start getting greedier and greedier and greedier, and the likelihood of people moving on up in the Roman Republic became less and less possible. I mean, there's a direct parallel between what was going on with Profaci and the Gallo crew. I mean, and by extension, if you look at the Bonanno family and Joe Bonanno family, they were having the same problems themselves, where the heads of these families, which were, say, let's just fill in for the Senate, were becoming greedier and greedier. And the people who were actually doing the work were becoming disenfranchised with the entire system. And Joe Gallo, broke one of these unwritten rules. You don't directly attack your boss. You got to go and get approval first before you can do this. And by doing this, he basically set a precedent where all these unwritten rules that kept everything running smoothly were off the table. I mean, and if you look at the Roman Republic, it's actually quite remarkable how quickly it did fall because people started breaking these unwritten rules. And then once that's, broken, the whole system doesn't work. I mean, really, any nation runs on these kind of unwritten rules. Like the United States, I'll use an example. Like, you guys have the Constitution. It's like, yes, it's written down. But if no one really respects the Constitution, what the Constitution means, and they're just willing to discard it, then it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't really work. In the sense, it functions as these unwritten protocols, these unwritten rules that you generally agree with on a societal level. And that's much of how the Mafia ran. But once you have one person or a couple of people that just disregard all those unwritten rules, the whole thing collapses. Eventually it gets replaced by something else most of the time. In the case of the Mafia, I just don't think it ever recovered.
Yeah, somebody like Joe Profaci is really pushing the rules and he's abusing the rules. And that causes the reaction of somebody to even go over the top reaction of pushing against the rules. And it's a escalator of escalation. Like, you can't get off of it. One side has to escalate over another. And I mean, that really is, I think that probably it's something like the Roman Republic is a pretty apt analogy in that way. I think in a lot of ways, though, that the Mafia kind of recovered after Crazy Joe as well. I think we'll see in the second episode, I think that, no, I mean, you had people who were rats or, flipped against the Mafia and broke Omerta. But I think that this whole idea that nobody broke Omerta, I mean, people were singing all the time in a lot of different ways. But I think that the slow degrading of the Mafia probably started pretty spectacularly right here.
Yeah, and I think that what makes Joe so unique in the sense that he was just a soldier that went after a boss. Or if you look at previous examples, it was usually the boss is coming to an agreement, hush-hush agreement. We're going to take care of this one boss. And if you look at, let's say, the Joe Masseria and Maranzano, I mean, it's war, right? It was all at war.
Yeah.
So the circumstances were slightly different. Whereas I don't think without Joe Gallo, you don't have John Gotti taking out Paul Castellano.
No.
That's an example, right?
Well, we're going to leave it at this point right here with Crazy Joe sitting in prison. But we are definitely going to talk next time about his time in prison and then his career after prison, leading up to talking about Crazy Joe as he's portrayed in mass media. Really the first Mafia star, you might call him. But so if you have questions or comments about what we talked so far, you have show ideas, we definitely like to hear them. And we would definitely love it if you're enjoying what you hear to tell a friend or two about the show so that your friends can become friends of ours.